Chapter 6, The Empty Museum of the Vedas. Ashvatthama began with museums. He had trusted memory for too long. Now he wanted a stone, metal, coin, brick, inscription, seal, pillars, and ash. If the Vedic world had been the beating heart of ancient India, surely some trace of its pulse would appear in the earth. He traveled through museums in India. He studied catalogs from Britain. He looked for fire temples of Vedic type, for early temples of Indra, Varun, Mitra, Ashwins, Soma, and Agni. He searched for inscriptions praising the Veda in the before Christ era centuries. He searched for kings boasting of Vedic sacrifice before the age of classical Sanskrit court culture. He found stupas, he found pillars, he found Buddhist railings, Buddhist inscriptions, Buddhist donors, Buddhist monastic sites, Buddhist universities, Buddhist images, Buddhist stories in stone. He found Ashoka everywhere. He found silence where he expected Veda. The silence disturbed him more than a denial would have. A denial at least acknowledges the subject. Silence suggests either absence, marginality, or deliberate erasure. All three possibilities were dangerous. He studied the Mauryan world. Ashoka had used Prakrit. In the northwest India, he used Kharoshti. In Afghanistan, he used Greek and Aramaic. The empires knew how to speak to people in their language. Yet Ashoka did not proclaim the Veda in Sanskrit. He did not fill his pillars with hymns to Indra. He did not announce Soma sacrifices. He spoke of dharma, ethics, restraint, compassion, respect for sects, and the welfare of beings. Why? If Sanskrit had been the divine language of the land, why did an emperor who wrote across continents not use it? If Vedic sacrifice was the central public religion, why did the grandest inscriptional program of early India did not make it visible? Ashvatthama did not say this proved the Vedas did not exist. He was no longer a simple man. But he wrote in his notebook, archaeology first. If a tradition leaves no public footprint for centuries, don't assume it ruled the public world. He turned to Buddhist centers, Nalanda, Bikramsila, Taksila, Gandhara, Mathura, Amravati. The material record did not look like a land organized around Vedic god. It looked like a land in which Buddhism, regional cults, merchant kings, and later Brahmanical forms negotiated a space. His old notes on the early Chinese Buddhist visitors now returned with force. Fahian and other pilgrims did not travel to India in search of Vedic fire altars, Indra temples, or Soma priests. They came for Buddhist texts, Buddhist teachers, Buddhist monasteries, Buddhist discipline, Buddhist pilgrimage places, and Buddhist philosophy. Their journeys were not a small episode. They were long, dangerous, trans-Asian project of learning. Fahian account, known as Record of Buddhist Kingdom, was among the earliest Chinese eyewitness account of Buddhist practices and pilgrimage sites in Central and South Asia. Hensang's 7th century journey created one of the most influential records of Indian and Central Asian religious geography. Yejing's writing give details of monastic discipline, sea routes, and the world of Buddhist learning. In these accounts, India appears prominently as the homeland of Buddha, the land of monasteries, relics, scriptures, teachers, and debates. For Ashvatthama, this did not mean that no Brahmanical or Vedic forces existed. Absence in a traveler's purpose is not the absolute absence in society, but the imbalance mattered. If Hindu Vedic institutions had been the overwhelming public face of early India, why did this seeker of religion leave such a thick Buddhist map and such a thin Vedic map? Why did the early international memory of India travel outwards so powerfully through Buddhism? He wrote a harsh line and then underlined it twice. When foreigners came to India for sacred knowledge in the early centuries, the road they most clearly described was Buddhist. Then came the Mitani clue. In treaty materials from second millennium before Christ era, divine names appeared far away from the modern Indian heartland. Mitra, Varun, Indra and Nasatis. These names echoed the Rig Veda. They appeared in a Hurrian Mitanni political world with an Indo-Aryan layer. Here was a strange fact. Names associated with Vedic religions were archaeologically visible outside India earlier than they were visible inside India's inscriptions. Ashvatthama felt the floor move. What if the Vedic stream was not originally the center of India? What if it was a memory from a northwestern, Iranian, Central Asian, or Mitanni related world? What if later Indra received, Sanskritized, and projected that stream backward? Or what if a small oral tradition did exist in the northwest of India but remained marginal until later political needs made it central? He did not know, but the old certainty had cracked. That night he took bhang not for pleasure but for release. He needed to dissolve the believer inside himself who demanded that the Veda be ancient because he loved it. Immortality had taught him one thing: love is not proof. He wrote, a seeker must love believers, atheists, agnostics, haters, monks, kings, and fools. But he must not let love become blindness. Outside, the 21st century was returning to identity politics. Everyone wanted an ancient world, an ancient title, an ancient superiority. Ashwatthama wanted something harder. He wanted to be free of belonging long enough to see. The museum silence was not absolute. Ashwatthama was careful about that. There were fire altars in archaeology, ritual spaces, painted pottery, seals, speculative identifications, and later inscriptions. There were scholars who built careful arguments for continuity. There were families that preserved recitation with astonishing discipline. He did not mock them. But the silence large enough remained large enough to stand inside. He found that believers often use the word oral as if it solved every problem. Oral tradition can indeed preserve extraordinary material. A song can travel for centuries. A genealogy can remember names when paper has rotted. Vedic recitation techniques are among the most sophisticated memory systems known. Ashwatthama respected it. Yet, oral tradition can also be invoked to escape evidence. Whenever a question becomes difficult, one can say it existed orally. Perhaps it did, but the perhaps is all the statement, but perhaps the statement is also a bridge built over an archaeological gap too quickly. He wrote, oral tradition is possible, oral certainty is not. In the British Museum, he stood before objects from Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, and India. The arrangement itself seemed political. Some civilizations spoke through stone and clay tablets, some through manuscripts copied later. Some were given glass cases, others were given caption. The museum was not neutral, no museum is neutral, but objects still possesses a stubbornness that stories lack. A broken rail from stupa does not prove all of India was Buddhist, but it proves someone built, donated, carved, and remembered in that form. An Ashokan edict does not prove everyone followed Ashoka's dhamma, but it proves a king publicly chose that language and moral vocabulary. A coin with a deity does not prove mass devotion, but it proves the deity had entered political imagery. Where then were the early public objects of Soma? He looked for Soma the way a detective looks for a missing person. Last seen in hymns, no confirmed public inscription in early India, possible relatives in Homa, possible cousins in Mitani names, later traces in Siva names, living shadow in Bhang or edible cannabis. The case becomes more interesting precisely because the body was missing. He also realized that the absence of Vedic temples to early gods should not be judged by later temple expectations alone. Early Vedic religion may not have been temple centered, it may have been ritual and altar centered. That explain part of the silence, but not all. If kings publicly valued it as later tradition claimed, some inscriptional trace might still be expected. Ashvatthama began drawing three circles in his notebook. One circle was textual memory, another was material evidence, the third was living practice. Soma sat uneasily among them. In textual memory, it was huge. In material evidence in India, it was faint. In living practice, Bhang or Kadival anyways stood near Shiva but not under the name Vedic Soma. A mystery is born when three circles refuse to overlap neatly. Ashvatthama now understood why Buddha and Ashoka had to stand near the center of his inquiry. They were not merely moral figures, they were evidentiary anchors. Buddha's memory produced pilgrims, institutions, images, and debates. Ashoka rule produced inscriptions that still speak. If later India reduced them while elevating less visible claims of antiquity, then the reduction itself needed explanation. Perhaps a civilization can forget its clearest evidence when that evidence threatens late power. The detective method also made him suspicious of absence being explained away too easily. Absence is not always disproof. A wooden altar decays, a ritual vessel melts, a manuscript burns, but repeated absence across different kinds of evidence becomes a question that deserves respect. The silence around early public Soma was not a void to be filled by confidence, it was a silence to be heard. He imagined a museum with three rooms. The first room contained what is recited, the second contained what is built, the third contained what is lived. The Vedas dominated the first room. Buddhism dominated much of the early second room. Bhang, Shiva, local cults, and later devotional practices occupied the third room. Soma was strange because it was loud in the first room, faint in the second, and perhaps disguised in the third. That strangeness was the heart of the book. This distinction gave him a cleaner formulation. The problem was not Veda versus Buddha. The problem was chronology, visibility, and power. A text may contain old layers and still become politically central later. A ritual may be ancient in a narrow circle and yet become a civilizational banner only after new alliances. A language may be older in grammar than its first inscription, but its public rise still needs historical explanation. He also separated two different questions that believers often combine. First, could Vedic oral tradition be ancient? Yes, oral systems can preserve astonishingly old material? Second, does the existence of oral preservation prove that the later public dominance existed from the beginning? No. A family can preserve a song for centuries without ruling a civilization. A priestly group can preserve recitation without leaving vast early monuments. Oral survival and public supremacy are not the same thing. If the Vedic establishment had been the overwhelmingly visible public face of India, Ashvatthama wondered why these pilgrims left such a dense map of Buddhist site and such a thin map of Vedic institution. One answer is purpose. They were Buddhist, so they wrote about Buddhism. That answer is partly fair, but even a purpose-driven traveler notices overwhelming public power when it surrounds him. The comparative thinness, therefore, remained a clue, not proof, but a serious clue. The Chinese visitors mattered because they were not modern activists in a 20th century debate. They were travelers of devotion and learning. Fahian, Hensang, and Itisang came looking for Buddhist texts, teachers, and discipline. Their interest shaped what they noticed, but their very interest reveals the prestige of Buddhist India. A civilization reputation abroad is not accidental. People undertake dangerous journeys towards what they believe is alive. Ashvatthama did not claim that every Indian village was Buddhist or that Brahmanical practices were absent. He knew better. India always had many worlds at once: a village shrine, a merchant guild, a monastery, a forest ascetic, a family priest, a royal inscription, and a wandering teacher can all exist in the same century. But the question was not whether other traditions existed. The question was which traditions were publicly legible, materially dense, and internationally remembered in the early record. The contrast with the Buddhist material visibility become impossible to ignore. Stupas stood where memory had become architecture. Railings carried donors' names. Monasteries sat along routes of trade and pilgrimage. Relics produced movements. Images created devotion. Chinese pilgrims crossed deserts and mountains because India was the living geography of the Buddha. The Buddhist record was not merely textual, it was institutional, visual, and international. The pillars mattered because they were not private mediations, they were state speech placed in stone. A society can hide many household rituals, but a ruler's inscriptions reveals what power wants to proclaim. Ashoka chose not to proclaim the supremacy of Sanskrit Vedic ritual. He chose accessible language and ethical command. To Ashvatthama, this was not a small detail. It was an argument carved into the landscape. Instead, the early record offered him a different pattern. Ashoka spoke in Prakrit, Greek, and Aramaic. He spoke of Dhamma, restraint, compassion, moral welfare, respect among sects, and discipline of rulers. He did not sound like a king announcing the triumph of Soma sacrifice. He sounded like a ruler trying to turn power away from cruelty after war had wounded his conscience. That did not make his empire pure. No empire is pure, but it made his public vocabulary morally startling. Ashwatthama then framed the problem like a lawyer preparing cross-examination. If Vedic religion had been the dominant public institution of early India in the way later memory sometimes implies, what would one expect to find? Not perfection, not a complete archive, but at least a pattern. Early public institutions naming Vedic gods, royal claims centered on Vedic sacrifices, material remains repeatedly pointing to Soma rituals, public monuments that made Indra, Varuna, Agni, or Soma visible in the same way stupas made the Buddha visible. Thank you. End of chapter 6.